It was an evening like any other, the kind where the air feels still and the world seems at ease. Jaden Hill had just spent the day with his mom. He fixed her leaky tap and laughed over stories of his childhood. As he stepped out of her house, the streets felt like home. He knew every crack in the sidewalk and every corner of the block. But tonight something felt off. His chest tightened, and he had the strange feeling that someone was watching him. He shrugged it off and kept walking, his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets. A police car turned onto the street, its headlights bright and cold. Inside were two officers, Bradley, who had years of experience, and Carter, who was still learning the ropes. They were out on patrol after hearing about a robbery nearby. The suspect? A black man wearing a dark hoodie. Bradley spotted Jaden almost immediately. "That's him," Bradley said, his voice low but sure. Carter glanced at him, unsure. "Are you sure?" "Trust me," Bradley replied, already pulling the car to a stop. Jaden noticed the car slowing down, the flashing lights cutting through the dark. His stomach dropped. He stopped walking, his breath shallow. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Bradley called out as he got out of the car. His tone was firm, like someone who expected to be obeyed. "We need to talk to you." Jaden turned slowly, his hands where they could see them. "What's going on?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Bradley said. His hand rested on the gun at his hip. Jaden's heart pounded. "I just came from my mom's house," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Bradley's eyes narrowed. "Just let us check," he said, stepping closer. Jaden stayed still, his hands raised slightly. Carter stood to the side, his expression unsure, like he didn't quite know what to do. "I don't have anything on me," Jaden said. "You don't need to do this." But Bradley wasn't listening. He moved forward, his voice sharp. "Turn around. Hands on your head." Jaden hesitated. "Why?" he asked. "I didn't do anything." That's when things started to spiral. Bradley's tone grew harsher. "Stop resisting," he barked, even though Jaden wasn't moving. Jaden froze, his arms still in the air. He felt trapped, like every move he made would make things worse. A neighbor stood on their porch, their phone held up, recording. The lights from the police car flashed in the background, painting the scene in red and blue. Jaden's face was tight with fear and anger, his breaths coming fast. Minutes later, Jaden was sitting on the curb, handcuffed. His mind raced, replaying everything that had just happened. He thought of his mom, her kind smile, and warm hugs. He thought of the plans he had made for his future. And now, here he was, on the ground, treated like a criminal. His chest felt heavy, not just from fear, but from the weight of something bigger, a system that seemed set against him. Across town, his mom's phone rang. She picked it up, smiling, expecting to hear a friend's voice, or maybe even Jaden's. Instead, it was a neighbor. The woman's voice shook as she explained what she had seen. "It's Jaden," she said, her words stumbling over each other. "They've arrested him. There's a video. You need to see it." Jaden's mom dropped the phone, her heart sinking. Tears welled in her eyes as she tried to understand how her son, her kind, hard-working boy, could end up in this situation. She grabbed her coat and her keys, her hands trembling. She had to get to him. She had to let him know he wasn't alone. As the night deepened, the video began to spread online. Strangers watched and shared, their hearts breaking for Jaden. In that moment, his story became more than just his own. It became a spark, a question. How many more? And what would it take to change things? The story spread like wildfire. News outlets grabbed onto it, each telling the story their way. Some called Jaden a victim of racial profiling, a young man caught in a system that too often judged people by their skin color. Others focused on the police, saying they were just doing their job. "It's not about race," one anchor said. "It's about safety." But safety for who? That was the question buzzing in the air, on social media, and in living rooms across the city. Officer Bradley stood firm. In interviews and meetings, he repeated the same lines. "I've been doing this for 15 years. You learn to trust your instincts," he said, his voice steady but defensive. To him, the stop wasn't about race. It was about doing what he thought was right to protect the area. Carter, though, wasn't so sure. He was the rookie, the new guy, and the night kept replaying in his head. He thought about Jaden standing there, his hands up, his voice calm, but confused. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen Jaden at all. Just a hoodie, just a shadow that fit the description. It nagged at him, that little voice in the back of his mind, asking, was it really him? Or was it just what we expected to see? Jaden's family stood by him like a fortress. His mom, Mrs. Hill, was small in stature, but mighty in spirit. She wasn't just a retired teacher. She was a storyteller. And now, she told Jaden's story everywhere she could. At church, in community centers, on the phone with reporters. Jaden's a good boy, she said, her voice strong but laced with pain. He helps his neighbors. He takes care of his sister. He didn't deserve this. Aaliyah, Jaden's younger sister, took to social media like a warrior. She shared the video, adding captions that struck a chord with thousands. They saw a hoodie, not my brother. They saw a stereotype, not Jaden. Her posts went viral, and soon hashtag Justice for Jaden was trending. The community felt the weight of the incident. Protests started small, but grew quickly. People marched with signs, chanting, "No justice, no peace." The air buzzed with anger and determination. Some protests stayed peaceful, filled with speeches and songs. Others turned chaotic, with clashes between protesters and police. Store windows shattered, sirens wailed, and the tension felt like a storm about to break. At the same time, counter-protests popped up. Groups rallied behind the police, holding signs that read, "Back the blue and support our officers." They argued that officers like Bradley and Carter faced danger every day and had to make split-second decisions. Jaden, meanwhile, was trying to hold himself together. He stayed home most days, avoiding the stares and whispers that seemed to follow him. The memory of that night felt like a weight he couldn't shake. The flashing lights, the sharp commands, the cold handcuffs on his wrists, it all played on repeat in his mind. To cope, he started writing in a journal his mom had given him. At first, the words came slow, but soon the pages began to fill. "They didn't see me," he wrote one night, the words scrawled in heavy ink. "They saw what they wanted to see. They didn't hear me. They heard what they expected." Writing became his escape, a way to process the anger, the fear, and the sadness. But even as he wrote, the world outside kept moving. Protests grew louder. Debates raged on TV and online. People took sides, arguing about justice, race, and the role of the police. Jaden's story was at the center of it all, whether he wanted it to be or not. His mom stayed strong for him, but at night, when the house was quiet, she cried. She cried for the son who had been treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. She cried for the world that seemed to see her boy as a threat instead of the kind, gentle soul she knew him to be. And Carter? He lay awake at night too. The rookie officer, full of doubts, wondered if he could have done something different. He thought about reaching out to Jaden, but what could he say? Sorry, felt too small, too simple for something so big. The city felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Would there be accountability? Would there be justice? And what would justice even look like? Jaden's journal entry that night captured it best. "The world saw me in handcuffs," he wrote. "But that's not who I am. I'm more than that moment. I'm more than their mistake." Jaden's legal fight began, and boy, was the deck stacked against him. His attorney, Maria De Leon, knew what she was walking into. She had handled cases like this before. Cases where the system seemed more interested in appearances than actual justice. When Maria first met Jaden, she saw more than just a young man caught in a mess. She saw someone who deserved to be heard, someone worth fighting for. Maria dove into the case, spending late nights combing through reports, statements, and police records. What she found didn't surprise her, but still made her stomach turn. The description of the robbery suspect was laughably vague. Black male, dark hoodie. That could have been Jaden, sure, but it also could have been dozens of other people on that same street. Where was the evidence? Where was the proof? And then there was Officer Bradley. Maria uncovered a troubling pattern in his past. There were complaints, lots of them. Residents had accused him of racial profiling more than once. But every time, those complaints seemed to vanish into thin air. No action taken, no accountability. It was like throwing stones into a bottomless well. Maria couldn't help but wonder how many people like Jaden had been caught in Bradley's net. The police department's data didn't make things look any better. It showed a glaring reality. Black residents were stopped and questioned far more often than anyone else. Maria knew numbers like these weren't coincidences. They told a story. And that story wasn't a good one. Meanwhile, across the aisle, Assistant District Attorney Paul Morrison was gearing up for his own battle. For Paul, this wasn't just about Jaden. It was about the police, the public, and the trust they placed in the justice system. He had a job to do, and that job was to secure a conviction. But even Paul felt the weight of the case. He knew it wasn't airtight. Still, the pressure was on. The department's reputation was at stake, and Paul was the one holding the reins. Back in Jaden's world, things were tough. His family and community were doing everything they could to support him. They held fundraisers to cover his legal fees, turning church basements and community centers into bustling hubs of hope. They lit candles at vigils, their prayers filling the night air. People showed up with casseroles, envelopes of cash, and words of encouragement. "We've got your back," they told Jaden. But all the support in the world couldn't erase what Jaden was feeling inside. He started pulling away from everyone, even his mom and sister. At night, he'd lie awake, replaying that moment over and over. The flashing lights, the cold cuffs, the way Bradley's voice cut through the air. It all felt like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. He started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. Maria noticed a change in him. She tried to pull him out of his shell, reminding him that he wasn't alone. "Jaden, this isn't just your fight," she said one afternoon, her voice steady and kind. "It's all of ours. You've got a whole community behind you. And me? I'm not going anywhere." Still, the weight of it all was hard for Jaden to shake. Every court date loomed like a storm cloud, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed at him. Maria, on the other hand, was as determined as ever. She filed motion after motion, chipping away at the prosecution's case. And now, she was preparing her biggest move yet, a motion to dismiss the charges altogether. She stayed up late, drafting and redrafting, her desk covered in papers and coffee cups. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The system wasn't exactly known for being fair, especially not to someone like Jaden. But Maria wasn't one to back down from a fight. The chapter ends with Maria sitting at her desk, staring at the motion she'd just finished. She took a deep breath, then smiled to herself. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready. For Jaden, for his family, for everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. Because sometimes the system might be stacked against you, but that didn't mean you couldn't fight back. Silence can be deafening. That's what Jaden learned in the weeks following his arrest. It wasn't just the silence of those who walked by that night, pretending not to see. It was the silence of the people who could have stepped up, who could have said, "This isn't right," but didn't. Jaden's neighborhood had seen its fair share of trouble. People that were used to keeping their heads down, staying out of things that didn't directly involve them. It was survival, plain and simple. So, when Maria De Leon, Jaden's attorney, started knocking on doors, she didn't get much more than polite nods and closed doors. "I'm sorry," one older man said, shaking his head. "I've got grandkids to think about. I can't afford to make waves." Maria understood. Fear has a way of silencing even the strongest voices. But it still stung. Inside his small apartment, Officer Carter wasn't silent, at least not with his wife. Late at night, when the kids were asleep and the world felt far away, he let the truth spill out. "I can't stop thinking about that kid," he said, staring at the ceiling. "What if we were wrong? What if we ruined his life for no reason?" His wife, Amanda, put a hand on his shoulder. "Then you need to do something about it," she said gently. "Cut aside. You don't understand how it works. Speaking out? That's career suicide. Nobody breaks the blue wall. But what about your conscience?" Amanda asked. Her voice was soft but firm, like she was holding a mirror up to him. Carter didn't have an answer. While Carter wrestled with his doubts, the system moved on as if nothing had happened. The internal review of the incident was, as Maria described it, a joke. The investigation barely scratched the surface. Nobody dug into Officer Bradley's history or questioned why a vague description had been enough to justify stopping Jaden. It was like trying to fix a leaky roof by slapping on a fresh coat of paint. It looked like they were doing something, but the problem was still there, dripping away. This is why we need independent oversight, local activist Tina Ramirez said during a community meeting. How can we trust a system to police itself? It's like asking the fox to guard the henhouse. The room murmured in agreement, but the frustration was palpable. People were tired of meetings, tired of speeches. They wanted change, but change felt so far away. In the middle of all this, Jaden was trying to hold on. His journal became his sanctuary. Late at night, he'd sit by the window, the moonlight spilling onto the pages as he wrote. At first, it was just his thoughts, raw, messy, full of anger and hurt. But over time, his words started to shift. They became less about what had happened to him and more about what he wanted to happen next. Maybe my voice can make a difference, he wrote one night. Maybe if I keep writing, someone will hear me. Maybe they'll see me. His mom found the journal one day and read a few pages. Tears streamed down her face as she realized how much pain her son was carrying. She hugged him tightly when he walked into the room. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're stronger than you know." But even with his family's support, the weight of silence was heavy. It wasn't just the neighbors or the officers or the system. It was the silence of society itself, a silence that had let things like this happen over and over again. Maria felt it too. She kept pushing, kept working, but there were moments when even she felt the odds pressing down on her. "Sometimes it feels like shouting into a void," she admitted to her paralegal one afternoon. "But we have to keep shouting, because if we stop, who's going to fight for kids like Jaden?" As the chapter closes, the silence isn't gone, but cracks are starting to form. Carter's doubts grow louder. Maria's determination burns brighter. And Jaden's words, written late at night in his journal, carry the hope that maybe, just maybe, his voice will break through. The courtroom buzzed with tension. It was the kind of place where every whisper felt loud and every glance seemed heavy with meaning. For Jaden, sitting at the defense table, it felt like his entire life was on trial, not just that one moment on the street. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Jaden as someone who didn't follow the rules, someone who looked like he had something to hide. He resisted lawful orders, the prosecutor said, his voice firm as he gestured toward the jury. And we can't ignore that. But Maria De Leon, Jaden's attorney, was ready. She stood tall, her voice steady but filled with passion. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, addressing the jury like they were friends sitting around her kitchen table. "This case isn't about resisting orders. It's about a young man who was judged not by his actions, but by his appearance." Maria started picking apart the prosecution's case piece by piece. She called witnesses who had been on the street that night. Some admitted they hadn't seen much. Others described Jaden as calm and cooperative. A few were hesitant, their voices wavering. But their words still painted a picture very different from the one the prosecution was trying to sell. The turning point came when a forensic analyst took the stand. The prosecutor had hoped to use him to bolster their case, but things didn't go as planned. Under Maria's cross-examination, the analyst admitted that the fingerprints found at the robbery scene didn't match Jaden's. Not even close. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Maria leaned into the moment. "So," she said, her voice calm but sharp, "not only do we have no physical evidence tying Jaden to this crime, but we also have proof that he wasn't there at all." That statement hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Outside the courtroom, the media had turned the trial into a spectacle. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and headlines swirled. Some outlets began to shift their tone, questioning whether Jaden had been unfairly targeted. Others doubled down, focusing on his hoodie, his walk, anything they could to make him seem like he fit the profile of a criminal. Jaden tried to tune it all out, but it was hard. He saw his face on TV, heard his name on the radio. Some people rallied behind him, calling for justice and demanding change. Others sent hate mail to his family, accusing him of playing the victim. It was exhausting, and it chipped away at him little by little. Maria reminded him to stay strong. "They'll try to define you," she said one day as they prepared for court. "But you know who you are. Don't let them take that away from you." As the trial dragged on, Jaden's case became a flashpoint for bigger conversations. People were talking about racial profiling, about how police interacted with black communities, and about the need for reform. Protests sprang up across the country, with people holding signs that read, "Justice for Jaden" and "End racial profiling." But for Jaden, this wasn't about movements or hashtags. It was personal. He didn't just want the charges dropped. He wanted an acknowledgement, something to show that what happened to him was wrong, that he wasn't just a face in the crowd or a statistic. He was a person, and he deserved better. One night, after a long day in court, Jaden sat with his mom and sister at the kitchen table. They talked about the trial, about the ups and downs. His mom held his hand and looked him in the eye. "No matter what happens, Jaden, you've already shown them who you are. You've got a strength they can't take away." Her words stuck with him. They were like a small light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the hardest times, he wasn't alone. The chapter ends with Jaden walking into the courtroom the next morning. The sun was shining, and the air felt fresh. He straightened his shoulders and took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Support sometimes comes from the places you least expect. For Jaden, those unexpected allies made all the difference. The first came from Officer Carter, the rookie cop who had been there the night Jaden was arrested. Carter had been wrestling with his conscience for weeks, and the weight of what happened had become too much to bear. One morning, Carter walked into Maria's office, his hands trembling. "I need to speak up," he said, his voice low but firm. "What happened that night? It wasn't right." Maria didn't waste a second. She prepped him for the stand, knowing his testimony could turn the tide. When Carter took his place in the courtroom, you could feel the tension in the air. The room was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. Carter started by describing the events of that night. At first, he sounded like he was sticking to the script, reciting the official story. But then his voice softened, and his words became raw and honest. I've been thinking a lot about that night," Carter said, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. "And I need to say this. The stop wasn't about what Jaden did. It was about what we assumed. We saw a young black man in a hoodie, and we let our biases make the decision for us." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Maria's eyes met Jaden's, and for the first time in weeks, she saw a glimmer of hope in his expression. But Carter wasn't the only one to step forward. Maria had been quietly working with Detective Lisa Monroe, an officer who had spent years investigating misconduct within the department. Lisa was the kind of person who didn't back down from a fight, even when it made her unpopular. Lisa's testimony was a game changer. She pulled out records and data that showed a clear pattern of racial bias in the department's stops and searches. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "This isn't about a few bad apples," she said, her voice steady. "It's about a system that's been broken for a long time." Her words hit like a hammer. The prosecution tried to discredit her, but Lisa's evidence was rock solid. It wasn't just her opinion. It was backed up by numbers and facts that couldn't be ignored. Of course, speaking out came with consequences. Carter found himself frozen out by his colleagues. The once friendly banter in the precinct turned into cold silence. Some officers wouldn't even look him in the eye. Lisa faced similar backlash. Her superiors questioned her loyalty, hinting that her career might suffer for her outspokenness. But neither of them backed down. They knew the stakes were too high. Meanwhile, Jaden's case continued to capture national attention. News outlets picked up on Carter and Lisa's testimonies, sparking debates about implicit bias and police accountability. People across the country began to rally around Jaden, using his story as a call to action. Protests grew larger, signs demanding justice filled the streets, and hashtags like #JusticeForJaden trended online. But for Jaden, this wasn't about fame or becoming a symbol. It was personal. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for his dignity, for the truth to come out. One night, after court had adjourned, Jaden sat with Maria in her office. The two of them shared a quiet moment, the weight of the day settling in. "Do you think they'll believe Carter and Lisa?" Jaden asked, his voice hesitant. Maria leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Truth has a way of breaking through," she said. "It might take time, and it might not be easy, but people are starting to see the cracks in the system. That's because of you, Jaden. Because you didn't give up." Jaden nodded. his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The next day, when Carter and Lisa walked into the courtroom, Jaden felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. They had risked so much to stand by him, to tell the truth, and that truth was finally being heard. The chapter ends with Maria standing to deliver another argument, her voice steady and strong. The fight was far from over, but with allies like Carter and Lisa, it felt like they finally had a chance. The trial was drawing to a close, but Jaden's story was far from over. What had started as one man's fight for justice had grown into something much bigger. It was no longer just about what had happened to Jaden. It was about what needed to change so it wouldn't happen to anyone else. Community leaders and activists seized the moment. They gathered in parks, community centers, and city halls, calling for changes that had been a long time coming. "This isn't just about one case," said Tina Ramirez, a well-known activist. "This is about a system that's broken, and it's time we fix it." The demands were clear and direct: mandatory bias training for officers, independent boards to oversee police conduct, and better community engagement programs. People weren't just shouting into the void. They were organizing, strategizing, and making their voices impossible to ignore. Jaden, who had once shied away from the spotlight, found himself stepping into it. At first, the thought of speaking in front of crowds made his palms sweat. But the more he did it, the more he realized the power of his voice. His words carried weight because they came from a place of raw truth. At one rally, Jaden stood in front of a sea of people holding signs and chanting his name. He took a deep breath and spoke from his heart. "I'm not here because I want attention," he said. "I'm here because this shouldn't have happened to me, and it shouldn't happen to anyone else. We deserve better. Our kids deserve better." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Jaden's words didn't just energize the movement. They also sparked conversations around dinner tables and in classrooms. People were finally talking about things they'd ignored for too long. Carter, the rookie officer who had testified on Jaden's behalf, found himself on a journey of his own. Speaking out had cost him a lot. He'd lost the camaraderie he once had with his colleagues, and some days, the weight of their silence felt crushing. But Carter didn't regret his choice. Instead, he started using his voice to push for change from within. "We can't fix this if we don't face it," Carter said during a panel discussion on police reform. "I was part of the problem, and now I want to be part of the solution." Lisa Monroe, the detective who had provided critical evidence during the trial, was also stepping into new territory. She began working with advocacy groups, using her knowledge to help identify systemic flaws. Lisa's work wasn't flashy, but it was essential. She spent hours poring over reports, speaking at town halls, and pushing for policies that prioritized accountability. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Lisa said in an interview, "but it has to start somewhere." And for me, it started with Jaden's case. For Jaden, the end of the trial didn't mean the end of his journey. If anything, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. He started volunteering with local youth programs, sharing his story, and helping young people see that their voices mattered. One afternoon, after speaking to a group of teenagers, a young boy approached him. "Does it ever stop being hard?" the boy asked, his eyes wide and serious. Jaden crouched down, so they were eye level. "It doesn't stop being hard," he said, "but you get stronger. And when you have people who believe in you, it makes the fight worth it." The boy nodded, and Jaden felt a spark of hope. Moments like these reminded him why he kept going. The chapter ends with Jaden standing on a stage at a community event, looking out at a crowd filled with faces of every age and color. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the scene. He smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because things were finally moving in the right direction. "Breaking chains isn't easy," he said into the microphone. "But every voice, every step, every act of courage brings us closer to freedom." The verdict was announced on a crisp autumn morning. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. When the judge declared Jaden not guilty, a wave of relief and triumph swept through his supporters. But the story did not end there. Jaden filed a civil suit against the police department, seeking accountability and reform. His case became a catalyst for change, inspiring similar lawsuits and policy changes across the country.